very sorry that our original keynote speaker wasn't able to come today, Adi Bhardwaj. He's done extremely interesting work on the clinic of Gita Schoff, who's here. And well, the idea would have been that he would have presented his experience at this clinic where human embryonic stem cell therapy is given to many patients who come from all over the world. I'm afraid that I'm incapable of imitating Adi, and so I have to offer you a very poor replacement. I can't even call it a replacement, but the idea was that today that we would have a debate, someone from the ISSCR and someone from a clinic that is internationally quite controversial. Well, I must say, after having heard Insoo's very nuanced talk, that a debate that would contrast the ISSCR with the views of Adi probably would have been impossible in the first place. I think views are changing, and I think the field has becoming so complex that we have to re-evaluate the terminology that we use to discuss the field. Not just medical tourism. I remember that 5 years ago there was an American researcher called Priscilla Sung, who's been doing a study with in the clinic of Dr. Hyun. And she wrote a book, many articles about this, called Medical Pilgrimages. And I think this term is very close to what we've heard about today. But do keep in mind, this work was based on what we at the time would have heavily criticized as clinical tourism. And I think Professor Hyun has had experience that he's known the difference all the time from the beginning between the international guidelines that have been formulated in Western countries that have usually very good healthcare systems, rather wealthy and traditionally medically institutionalized countries, which is not the case. In a large part of Asia, apart from Japan and South Korea. So what I'll do instead, and I'm very grateful for Insoo for pointing out that we're talking here about an enormous variety of stem cells. And I think we also should not forget that we're also talking about an enormous variety of patients, because if it comes to it, we always get out of the bag spinal cord injury patients that actually got their injury usually during their lifetime and are very, very keen to get treatment. For them, hope is quite a different method than for instance, muscular dystrophy patients who have maybe many years lived with the disease and are about, need to accept their future or non-future in order to even have a life. Many people cannot afford to live with hope, but prefer to have an acceptable life. That's one of the things that one scientist told me about in Japan just before the regulation was announced, the new regulation that has actually introduced the new pharmaceutical law in Japan in last year, May. And he said, well, I can see people just before they are going to be deceased becoming very busy because everyone needs to become a part of the clinical trial. So this kind of thinking is of course very different from the case of spinal cord injury. So just to caution that, and I agree with Dr. Huang and Insoo, who have pointed this out before, and hopefully this afternoon we'll get a bit more clarity, because we're going to talk about adult stem cells and other kinds of stem cells, and even though that's certainly not enough as a distinction, it will become a little bit more clear, I think. But having said that, I'm not going to talk about human embryonic stem cells. I'm going to talk more about bone marrow transplantation and mesenchymal stem cells in the case of Baker Biotech from China. It's not the same. It's a very different case. It's a company that's very well known all over the world, and the case of medical tourism has usually been illustrated with the rogue practices of Baker Biotech, a company that's still very active. You hear less from them nowadays. But what I would like to do is illustrate how, well, we've emphasized the developing health products that serve the needs of local populations in an ethical manner before, but we need to attune science research to the needs of patient demands. And that's also something that Insoo, of course, pointed out. But the question will be how to standardize research guidelines if the needs differ across nation states. Okay, if we have an American public, there will be different needs for a Chinese public. So can one set of guidelines be sufficient to regulate or even just have provide soft guidelines for people all over the world? It's a big question and an enormous problem for governments that cannot afford the kind of therapy that is now being condoned by the ISSCR. So that's a point for discussion. And another point where there will be, I think, a lot of controversy is about the payment, also as Insoo already pointed out. Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and I'm going to talk about why it's very important to say that many researchers that I actually interviewed in China actually thought that Baker Biotech's practices were quite reasonable, were quite acceptable. They accepted that a lot of money is being paid for therapies in that country, and they thought that internationally seen this kind of medical tourism, medical pilgrimage is quite acceptable. So why could that be so? Just a few words about the method used. Between July 2012 and March 2013, I asked 43 professionals about their views on biotech, and of those who have not been abroad for a long period of time, 15 out of 18 were not at all were surprised that there is a lot of foreign criticism of Baker Biotech's practices. So how can that be? These people are very well educated people. They are engaged with patients all the time. Are they particularly cruel? Are they very unethical? And so what can this be? Well, I will argue that we've been paying a lot of attention to so-called rogue companies, the exploitation of vulnerable patients and fraudulent therapies. But I think we need to understand better how the market provision responds to healthcare demands and acts on health needs and living conditions. So the circumstances of the patients and doctors is not the same everywhere. So we need to know better how to believe in the fruitful application of scientific knowledge, even if not yet evidence-based, leads to value realization of both research assets and products, without realizing that and without the patients being aware of that. There is no way that we can speak about ethical provision, not in a more socially ethical accepted way. We need to know how knowledge of exchange conditions in different countries facilitates experimental stem cell therapies. Because we know there is not just an ethical doctor that we would like, but we also want to have the whole industry that's now connected through cell processing, through research, through international conventions and payments that are linked to that doctor that the patient sees. So if we do not have a clear understanding of that, how on earth can we understand the motivations of the doctors that we speak with? And so this is of course an enormous challenge because the complexities through globalization are becoming greater. So we need to go beyond the view that the difference between good and bad therapy provision is a matter of just money, ethics, and evidence-based science. And theories focusing on exploitation and therapeutic fraud as drivers of development in the life sciences do not sufficiently take into account the interaction of the active roles of patients, companies, and governments. Just an example of an advertisement that I found on the internet by clinic practice. They actually advertise why it is better to go to Asia to perform your clinical trials. The arguments were there are fewer healthcare options than in the West. There's an increase in densely researched diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases and cancer. Well, take your pick. There are fewer clinical trials enrolling patients. The number of eligible patients is higher in urban areas, so it will be easy to do a clinical trial there. Doctors are referred, patients listen to the way they need to administer the medicine. So, as mentioned before, the bona fide versus rogue stem cell therapy is, I think we can agree now, is not valid. But how do we think about charging fees? Bona fide was always seen as charging fees is bad, because fee for trial patients shouldn't pay to be part of an experiment of unauthorized trials or research and pay for it, because someone else is going to make profit. The second idea around this was that a lack of independent research and ethics oversight makes for very bad practice. So if there's no IRB or ethical review board, then how can there be kosher therapy? And the third, the main point of departure is that unsupported by scientific evidence, the medicine may not be safe or lack efficacy. Well, I'm going to discuss these 3 points in connection with Baker Biotech. So, if you look at, just to illustrate the point a bit further about the complexities of this stem cell therapy, you see a picture of a Puhua clinic in a city called Tianjin in the north of China. And this clinic, you see the British flag on the cushion there. It's for British patients who have been visiting this clinic, also for stem cell therapies. A whole range of stem cell therapies are available in the clinic. You'd think in the country, China has forbidden experimental stem cell therapies. It's prohibited, apart from in military hospitals, and private companies can still go ahead to a certain extent. It's not allowed, but they do so. But this beautiful room is ensconced in a public hospital, of which the head is a very well-known academician who often speaks about bioethics. So how is that possible? Doesn't he know what's going on in his own hospital? Well, perhaps not. So how does one regulate such kind of practices in that case? And you would say in the first case, well, they obviously make money there, so that must be unethical. But here you see another case of Wu in a traditional Chinese medicine hospital, which is very much supported by the state. And it's a simpler affair here, where you can also go for your therapy. But obviously, there less money is being made, and the doctors there are just as devoted to the patient. So, as a patient, and how would you be able to find out what the conditions are? And if we think about the idea of medical pilgrimage, then I think that the belief that people have and the hope that they have to be helped in a country like China is one that is very hard to institutionalize through guidelines set up in European or countries or the States. So there's another problem here. It's been said experimentation shouldn't just take place, we should have clinical trials. If you look in the different countries around the world, what kind of guidelines and regulations are available? I think most countries in the world do have exceptions, do have regulatory spaces for new experimental research in the area of regenerative medicine. So in Europe you find a hospital exemption. There's also compassionate treatment in many countries, which in Europe is very different from the hospital exemption, but in other cases I think that Alok Sharma has been arguing for compassionate treatment to be institutionalized in India. But there's also patient-driven experimentation in trials. There's scientific experimentation, there's stem cell tourism, doubling as research. So as long as we label it as research, many hospitals in China could, in principle, have gone ahead. There are clinical studies, there's regulations for INDs we heard about just then. There's the UK special scheme, through which quite a lot of experimental research goes ahead, even more than with the hospital exemption. There's a new regulation from the British MHRA for the early access to medicine scheme. And there's in Europe the new law around MAPS, which is also doing a similar thing. So there are so many nuances between the kinds of therapy available. It's very difficult to imagine that it will be possible to have, again, like we still have, an elite form of definition of what is ethical for all. Well, here's the example of Baker Biotech. On asked about fees, ethics and scientific evidence are neither drivers of the field nor main determinants for judging the acceptability of Baker Biotech. I will look into how Baker manages its reputation, production and knowledge assets within China, and why unevidenced therapies are acceptable in the eyes of many Chinese researchers. Here we see the founding director of Baker Biotech, Hyun. He set Shenzhen Baker Biotech up in 1999. Shenzhen is a city in the south of China, and he set it up with capital from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Zhengzhou University, his alma mater, and Beijing University. He produces adult stem cell products from umbilical cord, cord blood and bone marrow stem cells, and applies these to an enormous range of diseases. He treated, nearly 4,000 people, and this is only in the space of 1 year. So that, you would say, is the prototype of what we would have regarded as quack stem cell provision. In Taizhou in 2006, Taizhou is not very far away from Shanghai in China, another facility was set up, a stem cell bank. It's the Taizhou industrial region is a central research zone for China's regenerative medicine and biomedical industry. Its industrial group is linked Fudan University, very good university in China, in Shanghai, Huazhong Science and Technology University, Nanjing University Medical School, Jiangsu University, Shanghai Jiaotong University, and Jiangsu Provincial People's Hospital. But these are not infamous places. It also has got many overseas collaborations. Here you see a picture of a facility in Brazil. They have enough finances to set up enormous hospitals, and they have very good relations with the Brazilian consulate, where trips are organized to this hospital. People are actually funded to make use of the services. Baker also is very well known for its management in the area of umbilical cord blood banks. As it's really not, many people think that Baker Biotech itself is a stem cell therapy provider. But in fact, it's got connections with many hospitals to which it sends the patients. This is one of the reasons that it can continue to exist as a provider of therapy, because it cannot be attacked for breaking the rules, the regulation. And all it has to do is process the cells, send the patient and the cells to an alternative place within China or abroad. And so its collaborations are really flourishing. But why is it possible that in China researchers still told me that Baker Biotech's practices are very acceptable? Well, in China itself, therapy is falling outside China's local healthcare provision, lists are commonly sold on a commercial basis. And total healthcare insurance coverage is quite rare. So people do not think it's something odd to pay for therapy. And apart from that, the payment of red envelopes, as they're called, it's basically a form of bribery, it's a euphemism, to create goodwill is widespread. And patient choice of medical doctors is a right, according to government rules, but for which many patients nevertheless pay extra money. Baker's services have attracted patients from all over the world who paid twice, or who used to pay twice as much as Chinese patients. Since 2012, I think the situation has become different. The Chinese patients pay a lot more as well. So also for many patients it is a problem that there is no alternative healthcare option for them. So they're easily attracted to Baker. Elite life science centers have found it hard to obtain permission to start phase 1 clinical trials for stem cell therapies. China was being confronted with a paradigm from the West, having told people that clinical trials are the only way to get their products on the market or to provide therapy, has now got a crisis in which people from various walks of research life, so you have the elite centers in the big cities, but you have many small centers that are also financed locally, we're confronted with an enormous problem. The Chinese government wants to stimulate the development of regenerative medicine because it sees that as its future, also a way of perhaps providing its large population with medicine, but it wants to also stick to international guidelines. And so it follows what's been developed in Europe and the States. At the same time, in the localities where investors want to help the patients, they invest their money because they want to have a quick translation into the clinic. So this kind of copying of international guidelines has created an enormous contradictions and dilemmas for governments. Baker itself has got only very little reputational risk. The poor scientific reputation of Baker is mainly abroad. And for the scientists that I spoke with who have been abroad in the States, in Japan or elsewhere, they are very much aware of Baker's bad reputation abroad. And they could tell me that it was for not keeping records for outsiders to inspection, for providing unproven therapies to patients, taking advantage of the placebo effect, not publishing its results in international science journals of reputation, unclear provenance of the cells used in therapy. This criticism, however, was also fought by Baker. Whether it did this in an appropriate manner, that's another question. Baker Biotech has been visited by very important people. Here you see a visit of President Hu Jintao. And I'm just going to quote what he said. This was in 2010. And you see on your right, you see Hyun, and they're chatting together about the therapy. And actually it was Wen Jiabao that said Baker he was talking about Baker here, and what he said was the world leading stem cell company is not Cambridge, not Singapore, not in the US, but in Shenzhen. In your hands, your mind, and in your fighting spirit. May wisdom be with you. So you can see that it's extremely difficult for everyone to keep up with what companies are actually doing. And I'm sure that Wen Jiabao wasn't really aware of what was going on and of the regulation. So it makes it a very complex issue. But in the meantime, Baker has built up rich experience of providing therapies. It says it writes articles that are published in top journals, and it, of course, advertises its IPR, its intellectual property rights, its patents. Here you can see a picture of what it has in its shop windows. And patient records now are kept, but it says that they are not open for audit for reasons of IPR and patient confidentiality. Here you see the IPR, sorry, IPR advertised also in its windows. So this is just to show that it's got IPR. For most of you, probably not clear. It also shows on its walls that it has the world's highest certificate for blood banking. This is one way with which it gets a lot of attention, also from provincial governments, for which it banks umbilical cord blood. So it's been doing everything to raise its profile. Also, since September 2010, Xiangbo has served as a member of the Standing Committee of the Regenerative Medicine Committee of the China Medical Biotech Association, become the Vice Director General of the National Technology Innovation Strategic Alliance of Stem Cell and Regenerative Medicine. And Baker is also mentioned now as one of the 3 stem cell facilities mentioned by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So as you can see, Baker has changed from a company that's been vilified by many to a leader in the now reformulation of the regulation in China. As it's been accumulating over time, a majority ownership of some of the provincial umbilical cord blood banks in China, and it's got major state support through collaborations with other universities and collaborations with foreign companies, also companies that have been criticized, such as Medistem. It's really expanding its power base quite fast. Of course, Baker, as many other of such companies, has a wealth of patient cases that you can find on YouTube. It advertises its placebo usage. You think, well, how does that happen? Is a placebo effect about the psychological effect of medicine when the medicine are really not efficacious? But yes, well, if there is an effect and you can use it and actually stimulate also through rehabilitation, and I'm aware this is crooked logic, then you can make use of the placebo. And so this is not everyone who says, not everyone is saying that, but this is a common argument used. And apart from that, criticism of Baker Biotech by many of the researchers is being seen with suspicion, because it's always the same mantra. China is a producer of very rogue medicine, just as other Asian countries. And so for many, it's they try to ignore whatever is being said now by international associations, apart from people in the elite labs. So I think the challenge is now, in fact, to try and include these people that are in the grey zone when further regulation is being formulated. But Chinese researchers, in defense of Baker Biotech, say that, well, we should stick to the rule of equipoise. They say that if there's no alternative treatment, and in China there is not much alternative treatment in many cases, we should welcome the patients to biotech. And without adequate healthcare insurance, and we hear today that the Japanese government can afford to pay healthcare insurance in a way that is not possible in China. In China, it would be suitable to have the patients to go to Baker Biotech. So fees that the company receive enable experimenters to continue their research and invest. This is an argument that I've heard also in India quite a lot. So if the government, if there is not enough state funding, like we have here in the UK or in other countries in Europe, for the scientists, where does the money come to provide some space for their development of regenerative medicine? So this is what I heard patients from the Spinal Cord Injury Association in India say, that, well, we have to pay them. Of course we have to, because how else can they further develop their therapies? And this was not out of desperation, it was said. It was just like, in our country, that's common sense. So if there's no access to funding, scientists experiment to help funding is the way of thinking. There's no permission to conduct trials, encourages responding to prevalent demand. This is happening also in the in some of the best institutions that now have been asked to stop any kind of further experimental stem cell research. I remember one researcher saying, well, in the south of China we have many patients that suffer from thalassemia, and after bone marrow transplantation these patients often develop graft versus host disease, and they believe that using mesenchymal stem cell together with the bone marrow treatment would maybe help these patients. And they heard that Osiris was organizing a clinical trial, but in China there was no way they could do this clinical trial. First place, they wouldn't get permission. Second place, there was no funding. So what do we do instead? We form our own associations, we form our own links with hospitals, and we form our own network. And then maybe afterwards, when the stem cell scene will change, such as it's doing now, perhaps we come across regulation that has changed. So why does the Chinese government then stick to this policy of, well, non-policy one should say, because it stops all the stem cell research apart from in stem cell therapy provision and experimentation apart from in military and police hospitals. Well, it doesn't really have any choice apart from stopping it before it announces a new regulation, because it needs to remain part of the international scientific knowledge networks, which may benefit the country in the long run. It also needs to remain active in the area to exert influence on agreements about international research regulation and the legitimacy of the conditions in which therapies are provided. It also wants to allow accumulation of research experience that is still being accumulated through companies and through the military hospitals. It also does it to sustain the link between national modes of governance, bioethics and popular demands for therapy. It allows it to continue, even though it's now on a very low scale. And it also wants to sustain a situation in which local clashes of interest cannot be resolved, such as the clashes of interest between the local governments that have put their money into this area of regenerative medicine, but are really not supposed to go on. Well, as a conclusion, if my time is up, then okay. Well, although experimental stem cell therapy are legitimized in terms of scientific evidence, research protocol and bioethics, its drivers are fueled by the demands of patients, funding, regulation of governments, knowledge assets and international knowledge of differences in therapy conditions. Experimental stem cell therapy developed through differences in science and health institutions and infrastructures at home and abroad. It's become the dynamics of the field to develop through actually the shopping around of the cheapest way of conducting clinical trials and experimentation. And experimental stem cell therapy often is seen as a regular exchange in China to fulfill a need rather than an ethical quackery. So the question will be whether the suitability of experimental life sciences as therapy providers is okay when there is no other option available in this country. But for now, it will remain prohibited in China. Whereas in the UK, in Japan, in South Korea, and we see also in the States, there seem to be measures on the way that announce changes that allow experimentation to go on again. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Margaret, and really useful to see that kind of zooming into some empirical work in a country where some of these complexities are, which Insoo also outlined, are really evident. Do we have questions of clarification for Margaret first? After that, I'll ask Insoo and Margaret to both take a seat here and hopefully go on to some discussion.
Yeah, there's one question which I thought like, or a little bit questionable with regard to the drivers of Baker, where you said the fees are not a driver, but it's more, maybe I misunderstood it, but it was ethics, fees and signs are not a driver, but here I'm skeptical of it. Fees are not a driver. Can you explain this in more detail? Probably I misunderstood the point, but you know.
Well, I think it's a very good question. Thank you, Joachim. I would say main driver. So they're not the main drivers of the field. I think for Baker Biotech, it's much more important to have its IPR developed, get its umbilical cord blood banked, and most of its earning is actually comes from banking. It's its assets that keeps it going. Even though the therapy prices are very high, so are the reagents. The reagents that it needs to import. Many of the facilities are very expensive in the first place. So I'm not even convinced that it makes so much money on the therapies it provides. It's the links it has with the hospitals that could gain its profits, but it's mainly for its credibility as umbilical cord blood banking and research really that it's keeping afloat. So in that sense, I would say fees are not the drivers of companies such as Baker Biotech. This argument is already also been made by Keem Burge. I don't know where he's here now. Anyway, well, I've also said I think the ethics is also not something that we should concentrate so much on if we do it in a very narrow sense. But I think Insoo would agree with that, it seems. Ethics are far broader than just the informed consent and the signature that we give when we are actually in need of therapy. And so many patients in China don't even understand it, even though people get used to it now. But even the vocabulary we use, you know, obtaining consent, it really shows where the balance of power lies. It's in the person that wants to have consent. And the consent is taken from someone who is already very obviously motivated to have the therapy. So that's not where we need the ethics. The ethics is needed many steps before that, and probably most urgently in society itself, where these discussions should be open. And that's something that also can be questioned in China, which, well, I think the discussion has been stimulated lately, but only very lately, and it's very difficult to organize conferences or even workshops that engage with the public. We have tried to do this in Peking Union Medical College. Su Li Sui and Xin Qing and Ye Yang have been involved in organizing a workshop actually to engage the public to discuss about the needs of patients and the possibility for them to have stem cell treatment. And this was for them the first time, it might be the first workshop ever being organized in this country. So even though there has been some discussion going on about embryonic stem cell research, it's not at a level that I would say engages with the population at large. And it is going to be a matter of that, because if we see the function of clinical trials in medical healthcare nowadays already in China, and the enormous profits that are made in it, it's an enormous consideration for the government.
Thanks, Margaret. If there are no other questions of clarification, okay, there's one here.
Thank you, Margaret. It's very interesting. And I'm from Taiwan, and I can provide some understanding from the outsider or in between from the China or Western world. I think, and the government probably are aware of the criticism, but they are not bothered because they probably treat the boss as a national hero, such as Robin Hood, because he fulfilled the provision which the government failed to to provide. So I would say there's always like this the two-track system in China, or I would say even in law, we have like a saying, government policy in the top, but industry strategy in the bottom. So there's always like two tracks. In reality and in theory, there are always conflicts, but they prefer to see this as a broader flexibilities as opposed to the Western stringent paradigm. So this is only my observation.
It's interesting that Hyun's position in the media has changed. I think when there was awareness about Baker Biotech, I think the profile has been lowered, in fact, and I think the government is worried about it. It's an extremely hot debate, which is the reason for no conferences or discussions taking place on this. It's very difficult also to find researchers who, in public, want to defend cell therapies at the moment. So I think that you're right. I mean, there's a difference between what you want to show the public and what is going on really. That happens, I think, in all of Asia, but also in our country. So.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Insoo, would you like to come and join Margaret on the table here and